Montana Territory, 1872. Dust billowed across the wooden platform of Thunder Creek Station as the train pulled away, its whistle fading into the vast expanse of prairie. Teresa Wilson stood alone, her 18-year-old shoulders slumped beneath the weight of uncertainty. Her azure blue dress, once pristine when she had boarded the train in Boston 3 days prior, now bore the stains of travel. The late afternoon sun glinted off her honey-blonde hair, which had mostly escaped its pins during the journey. The station was little more than a weathered wooden platform with a small ticket office. No one had come to meet her. The letter from her aunt had promised she would be collected, but as Teresa surveyed the empty station and the small cluster of buildings that comprised the entirety of Thunder Creek, she felt the first stirrings of panic. "Excuse me," she called to the station master, a gray-bearded man who was already locking the ticket office door. "I was to be met by my Aunt Martha Daniels. Do you know her?" The man paused, his face creasing with concern. "Martha Daniels, ma'am, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Martha passed on about 3 weeks ago. Influenza took her quick." Teresa felt her knees weaken. "That cannot be. I received her letter only a month ago. She invited me to live with her after my parents." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Sorry, miss, news travels slow out here." The station master shuffled uncomfortably. "Town's got a small boarding house if you need a place to stay until you sort things out." Teresa nodded numbly, feeling the last of her composure slipping away. She had come west with her last $20 and the promise of family after losing her parents to a fire that had consumed their Boston home. Now she stood alone in a territory she knew nothing about, with no relations and little money. "Which way to the boarding house?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "End of the main street, but—" The station master hesitated. "Mrs. Holloway ain't fond of charity cases. Her rates run $2 a night." 10 days. She had 10 days before she would be completely destitute in a strange town. Teresa straightened her spine the way her mother had taught her. Ladies did not crumble in public, no matter how dire the circumstances. "Thank you," she said with as much dignity as she could muster, picking up her small trunk and starting down the steps of the platform. "Miss," the station master called after her, "this ain't Boston. The Montana Territory can be unkind to those who come unprepared." His warning followed her as she made her way toward the dusty Main Street, the setting sun casting long shadows across her path. Thunder Creek was barely a town. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and scattered buildings stretched along a single dirt road. People paused to stare at the newcomer, a young woman clearly out of place in her travel-worn Eastern dress. Teresa had been raised to believe that a proper life followed a predictable pattern: education, marriage, children, and social standing. But her parents' sudden death had shattered that path, leaving her with a truth she couldn't escape. In this world, security was an illusion, and trusting in others only led to disappointment. The West represented her last hope, but even that had turned to dust before she could grasp it. As she struggled with her trunk toward the boarding house, the weight becoming increasingly unbearable, a deep voice called out from behind her. "Ma'am, might I offer some assistance with that trunk?" Teresa turned to find a young man leading a chestnut horse. He couldn't have been more than 25, tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the edges of his wide-brimmed hat. His face was tanned from the sun but clean-shaven, with kind blue eyes that held her gaze steadily. He wore simple clothes, a blue work shirt, worn jeans, and boots covered in the dust of the trail, but carried himself with quiet confidence. "I can manage," Teresa replied automatically, though her arms ached from the effort. The young man smiled, revealing a small dimple in his right cheek. "No doubt you can, ma'am, but there's no cause to struggle when help's offered freely. Name's Andrew O'Malley." "Most folks call me Drew." For a moment Teresa hesitated, her natural wariness battling against practical necessity. Finally she nodded. "Teresa Wilson. I would be grateful for the help, Mr. O'Malley." "Just Drew, please." He easily lifted the trunk, settling it across his saddle. "New to Thunder Creek." "Yes." She fell into step beside him, noticing how he shortened his stride to match hers. "I was to stay with my Aunt Martha Daniels, but I've just learned she passed away recently." Drew's expression sobered. Martha was a fine woman, the whole town attended her service. He studied Teresa's face. "You have her eyes same color blue." "I never met her," Teresa admitted. "She was my father's sister, but they had a falling out before I was born. She wrote to me after my parents died, offering me a home." They reached the boarding house, a two-story building with peeling white paint and lace curtains visible through dusty windows. Drew set her trunk down on the porch. "Mrs. Holloway runs a tight establishment," he said, glancing at the door. "But if you're Martha's kin, you might want to know that your aunt owned a small homestead about 3 miles outside of town. Nothing fancy, mind you, but it's yours by rights if you're her only living relation." Hope flared briefly, then dimmed as Teresa considered the practicalities. "I wouldn't know the first thing about running a homestead. I was raised in the city." "Folks help each other out here," Drew replied. "It's the only way to survive." He hesitated, seeming to debate something internally before continuing. "I ranch about a mile from your aunt's place. I could show you the property tomorrow if you'd like." Before Teresa could respond, the boarding house door opened, revealing a stern-faced woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "If you're looking for a room, I'll need payment in advance," she announced without preamble. $2 a night, meals extra." "Mrs. Holloway," Drew nodded respectfully. "This is Teresa Wilson, Martha Daniels' niece from back east." The woman's expression shifted slightly. "Martha never mentioned family." "She invited me to live with her," Teresa explained. "I didn't know she had passed until I arrived today." Mrs. Holloway's gaze softened marginally. "That's a hard welcome to Thunder Creek. Still, business is business. I can't offer charity in these difficult times." "Of course," Teresa said, reaching for her reticule to count out the money for one night. She couldn't afford to waste her limited funds, but she needed time to consider her options. Drew cleared his throat. "Mrs. Holloway, Miss Wilson has had a long journey and just received difficult news. Perhaps you could see your way to offering the family rate, at least for tonight." The older woman pursed her lips, studying Teresa. $1 then includes breakfast." "Thank you," Teresa said, handing over the coin with relief. After Mrs. Holloway showed Teresa to a small, clean room on the second floor and left her alone, Teresa sank onto the narrow bed, finally allowing the tears she had been holding back to fall. Everything she had planned, everything she had hoped for, had vanished in an instant. She was truly alone in a world that had shown little kindness. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Hastily wiping away her tears, she opened it to find Drew standing in the hallway, hat in hand. "Pardon the intrusion, Miss Wilson, but I wanted to make sure you were settled." His eyes took in her tear-stained face, but he was gentleman enough not to remark on it. "I've arranged with the general store to deliver some provisions to your room. Nothing fancy, just some bread, cheese, and fruit. Thought you might prefer a quiet meal tonight." Teresa was stunned by the unexpected kindness. "Mr. O'Malley, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly." "It's no great expense," he interrupted gently. "And out here, neighbors look after each other. If you'll permit me, I'll return tomorrow morning to take you to see your aunt's property. Then you can decide what you want to do." "Why would you help a complete stranger?" Teresa asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. In her experience, men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. Drew's expression remained open and honest. "Because someone did the same for me when I first came here 5 years ago. I was young, green as spring grass, and would have failed if not for the help of others." He paused. "The West can be harsh, Miss Wilson, but it rewards those who face its challenges with courage and who aren't too proud to accept a helping hand when offered." There was something in his straightforward manner that calmed Teresa's misgivings. "Then I accept your kind offer, Mr. O'Malley, thank you." As he bid her good night and walked away, Teresa closed the door, feeling something she hadn't expected to find in this dusty frontier town, a small spark of hope. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Teresa had slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by images of her burning Boston home and the aunt she would never meet. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a pale green cotton that had traveled better than her blue, and twisted her honey-blonde hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Downstairs, she found Drew waiting on the porch, looking fresher than anyone had a right to after what she assumed had been a long ride into town. He had exchanged yesterday's blue shirt for a clean white one, and his boots, though still worn, had been brushed free of dust. "Good morning, Miss Wilson," he greeted her, the morning sun catching in his hair as he removed his hat. "I've brought a wagon for our journey. It's more comfortable than riding double, and we can bring back any of your aunt's belongings you might want to keep." Teresa was touched by his thoughtfulness. "You seem to have thought of everything." His smile was warm, not everything, just the practicalities. He helped her into the wagon with a steady hand, then climbed up beside her. As they pulled away from the boarding house, he added, "I should warn you that your aunt's place has been empty for a few weeks. It might need some attention." "I appreciate your honesty," Teresa replied, watching as the small town gave way to open countryside. The landscape was unlike anything she had seen before, vast rolling hills covered with grass that moved like water in the breeze, punctuated by stands of cottonwood trees along distant creek beds. The sky stretched endlessly above them, a blue so intense it almost hurt to look at. "It's beautiful," she murmured despite herself. Drew nodded. "It gets in your blood." "When I first came here from Pennsylvania, I thought I'd work a few years, save some money, and head back east. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else." "What brought you west?" Teresa asked, genuinely curious about this man who had offered help so readily. "Same as most, opportunity." He guided the wagon around a rutted section of the trail. "My father was a blacksmith, wanted me to follow in his trade. I had different ideas. Worked as a ranch hand in Colorado, then Wyoming before settling here. Saved every penny until I could buy my own small spread." His voice held quiet pride. "It's not much compared to the big ranchers, but it's mine." "You've accomplished a great deal for someone so young," Teresa observed. Drew laughed, the sound easy and genuine. "I'm 26, hardly a boy. Out here you grow up fast or you don't survive." They fell into comfortable conversation as the wagon rolled through the countryside. Drew pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's history, from the indigenous tribes who had first inhabited the land to the more recent settlers. His knowledge was extensive, gained not from books but from listening to those who had come before him. After about an hour's journey, he guided the wagon off the main trail and onto a narrower path that wound through a stand of cottonwoods. As they emerged from the trees, Teresa caught her first glimpse of her aunt's homestead. It was smaller than she had imagined, a simple one-story cabin with a covered porch, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, a chicken coop, and a corral. A vegetable garden, now overgrown with weeds, stretched to one side of the house. Behind the buildings, a creek meandered through a small valley, the water catching sunlight in brief, brilliant flashes. Drew brought the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin. "This is it. Not much to look at, I know, but the land is good." "Your aunt managed to make it pay, mostly through her garden and chickens. She sold eggs and vegetables in town." Teresa climbed down from the wagon before Drew could assist her, walking slowly toward the cabin. It was a far cry from the elegant Boston townhouse where she had grown up, yet there was something appealing about its sturdy simplicity. Drew followed a few paces behind, allowing her space. The door should be unlocked. "Folks don't bother much with locks out here." The cabin's interior was dim after the bright sunshine, but as her eyes adjusted, Teresa saw a single room divided by function rather than walls. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner beside a rough-hewn table and two chairs. A bed with a colorful quilt occupied another corner, while a rocking chair sat before a small fireplace. Shelves lined one wall, holding books, dishes, and jars of preserved foods. Everything was coated with a fine layer of dust, but otherwise the cabin looked as if her aunt had just stepped out for a moment and would return at any time. Teresa ran her fingers along the edge of the table, feeling an unexpected connection to the woman she had never met. "It's so small," she said softly, "but it feels like a home," Drew finished for her. "Your aunt was proud of this place, built most of it herself with some help from neighbors." Teresa turned to him, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of her situation. "Mr. O'Malley, I don't know the first thing about running a homestead. I can't even cook properly. My parents employed a cook and housekeeper." Rather than looking shocked or amused, Drew nodded thoughtfully. "Learning takes time, but you seem like a determined sort. If you decide to stay, there are folks who would help. Mrs. Holloway can be stern, but she's a fine cook and might be willing to teach you. The ladies from church often assist newcomers." He hesitated before adding, "And I'd be happy to show you the basics of caring for the animals and garden." "Why would everyone help a stranger?" Teresa asked, still struggling to understand the frontier mentality. "Because today you're a stranger, tomorrow you're a neighbor, and next year you're family," Drew replied simply. "That's how it works out here. We depend on each other." Teresa wandered to the bookshelves, examining the titles. Many were practical guides to farming, animal husbandry, and medicine, but others were novels and poetry collections. She pulled out a worn copy of Wordsworth's poems, opening it to find an inscription. "To my dearest Martha, may you find beauty in your new wilderness. With love, your brother Edward. My father, Teresa whispered, touching the faded handwriting. Perhaps the siblings' estrangement hadn't been as complete as she had believed. Drew cleared his throat. I should check the barn and outbuildings while you look around. Take your time. As he stepped outside, Teresa continued her exploration of the cabin. In a small trunk at the foot of the bed, she found neatly folded clothes, too small for her but carefully made. Beneath them lay a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon. With a sense of trespassing, she untied the ribbon and opened the top letter. It was dated nearly 2 decades earlier and addressed to my dear brother Edward. The letter spoke of Martha's life on the frontier, the challenges and joys she had found there, and her hope that someday he would visit with his wife and the daughter she had never met. The final paragraph caught Teresa's heart. I have built a life here that sustains me, Edward. It is not the life our parents envisioned for either of us, but it is rich in ways they could never understand. There is freedom in this wilderness, and a community bound not by social standing, but by genuine care for one another. I wish you could see it through my eyes. Teresa carefully returned the letter to its place, her mind whirling with possibilities she had never considered. She had come west out of desperation, seeking only survival. But perhaps there was more to be found here, a different kind of life than the one she had been raised to expect. When Drew returned, he found her sitting in the rocking chair by the fireplace, staring thoughtfully into the empty grate. The barn's in decent shape, he reported. Could use some patching before winter, but nothing urgent. The chickens are gone, of course, but the coop is sound. Your aunt's 2 milk cows are at my place. I've been caring for them since she fell ill. Teresa looked up at him. You've been maintaining her property all this time. Drew shrugged, seeming almost embarrassed. Not just me, several neighbors have helped keep an eye on things. No one was sure if she had family coming. The station master said she died 3 weeks ago. Why hasn't anyone claimed her property? Land can't be claimed until it's clear there are no heirs, Drew explained. Most folks expected someone would eventually show up, and if not, the property would be auctioned by the county in about 6 months. Proceeds would go to the church, as your aunt specified in her will. There's a will? Teresa asked, surprised. Drew nodded. With Judge Barnes in town, you should see him when we return. As her only living kin, everything would rightfully come to you. The weight of the decision before her pressed down on Teresa's shoulders. She had come west with nothing but hope and $20. Now she was being offered land, a home, and livestock, a life completely foreign to her experience and training. The prospect was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. I need to think, she said finally. Of course, Drew moved toward the door. I'll wait outside, take all the time you need. Alone again, Teresa walked to the small window that looked out toward the creek. The water sparkled in the midday sun, and beyond it hills rolled to the distant horizon. It was nothing like the crowded streets of Boston, with their noise and soot and pressing humanity. Here there was space to breathe, to think, to become. She thought of her parents, of the life they had planned for her, marriage to a suitable man from their social circle, a townhouse not far from theirs, children raised with the same expectations and limitations. It had seemed the natural order of things until the fire had destroyed not just her home but her place in that ordered world. The West offered no such certainty. Here, survival depended on adaptability, hard work, and the goodwill of neighbors. It was terrifying, but it also offered something she had never had in Boston, the freedom to define herself on her own terms. When she stepped onto the porch, Drew was sitting on the steps, whittling a small piece of wood with a pocket knife. He stood when he saw her, tucking the knife and wood into his pocket. I've made my decision, Teresa announced, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm staying. Drew's face broke into a smile that transformed his already handsome features. I had a feeling you might. Your aunt had the same look in her eyes, determined, even when faced with impossible odds. I know nothing about this life, Teresa admitted. I will need help. And you'll have it, Drew assured her. Starting with getting this place back in order. If you're amenable, I can round up some folks to help clean and make repairs this weekend. I couldn't ask people to. You're not asking, he interrupted gently. I'm offering. It's how things are done here. When Johnson's barn burned last year, 20 men showed up to rebuild it. When the Miller baby came early, every woman in the county took turns helping. Your turn to receive, someday your turn to give. Teresa felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest at the concept of such community. In Boston, charity was something bestowed from above, with clear distinctions between givers and receivers. What Drew described was something altogether different, a web of mutual support with no shame attached to needing help. "Thank you," she said simply. "I accept." The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Judge Barnes confirmed Teresa as Martha's legal heir, transferring ownership of the homestead and its modest savings account at the Territorial Bank. Mrs. Holloway, upon learning of Teresa's decision to stay, reduced her daily rate and offered to teach her basic cooking skills each morning before breakfast. Word spread quickly through the small community that Martha Daniels' niece from Boston had come to claim her inheritance, and Teresa found herself the recipient of unexpected kindnesses: a basket of fresh eggs from the miller's wife, offers of seedlings for her garden from the general store owner, invitations to Sunday services from the minister's wife. By Saturday morning, when Drew arrived with his wagon loaded with supplies, and followed by 3 other wagons carrying neighbors, Teresa had begun to understand what he had meant about community. Men set to work repairing the barn roof and fence, while women helped Teresa clean the cabin from top to bottom. Children chased chickens, a gift from the Wilkinsons, into the newly repaired coop. By sundown, the homestead had been transformed. The cabin gleamed with polish, the garden had been partially cleared and planted with late summer vegetables, and the animals, 2 cows, 6 chickens, and a horse gifted by Drew himself, were settled in their respective places. A communal meal spread across hastily assembled tables under the cottonwoods, with every family contributing dishes. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, Teresa found herself seated beside Drew, watching as neighbors chatted and laughed together. "Is it always like this?" she asked quietly. Drew followed her gaze. "Mostly, we have our disagreements and difficulties like anywhere else, but when it matters, people come together." "I've never experienced anything like it," Teresa admitted. "In Boston, we knew our neighbors by name, but not by heart." Drew smiled at her phrasing. "That's a pretty way of putting it. Knowing by heart is what gets you through winters out here." As the gathering began to disperse, with families loading into wagons for the journey home, Teresa found herself approached by an elderly woman she had been introduced to as Widow Parker. "You've got a good start here, girl," the older woman said without preamble. "But winter comes hard in Montana. You'd be wise to consider taking a husband before the snow flies." Teresa blinked in surprise. "I've only just arrived." "Precisely my point," Widow Parker interrupted. "There's not much courting time left. Half the unmarried men in the county will come calling now that they know you're here to stay. A young, pretty thing like you with her own land." "You could have your pick." Before Teresa could formulate a response to this unexpected assessment of her marriage prospects, Drew appeared at her side. "Mrs. Parker, I believe your son is looking for you." "They're ready to depart." The older woman gave him a knowing look. "I see you're already staking your claim, O'Malley. Can't blame you, she's a fine one." With that parting observation, she made her way toward a waiting wagon. Teresa felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I apologize for that." Drew shook his head, looking equally uncomfortable. "No need, Mrs. Parker speaks her mind freely." "One of the privileges of being 83, I suppose." He hesitated. "Though she's not entirely wrong about the coming winter, it can be challenging for those not accustomed to it." "Are you suggesting I should find a husband before the first snow?" Teresa asked, a hint of defiance in her tone. "Not at all," Drew replied quickly. "Only that you shouldn't be too proud to ask for help when you need it. Winter is beautiful here, but it can also be dangerous for those caught unprepared." As the last of the neighbors departed, leaving behind a transformed homestead and a well-stocked pantry, Drew lingered, helping Teresa extinguish the outdoor lanterns. "I can't thank you enough," she said as they walked toward his wagon. "None of this would have been possible without your help." Drew looked down at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "You're doing the hard part, Miss Wilson. It takes courage to start a new life in an unfamiliar place." "Teresa," she said impulsively. "If we're to be neighbors, you should call me Teresa." A slow smile spread across his face. "Teresa then, and I'm still just Drew." He climbed into his wagon but paused before taking the reins. "I'll come by tomorrow evening to check on things if that's agreeable, and perhaps I could help you learn to milk those cows properly. It takes some practice." "I would appreciate that," Teresa replied, finding herself strangely reluctant to see him leave. As his wagon disappeared down the path toward the main trail, Teresa turned back to look at the cabin, her cabin now. Lantern light spilled from its windows, creating a warm glow against the darkening landscape. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt something like hope taking root within her. The Montana Territory had already shown itself to be a place of unexpected possibilities. Perhaps here, among these straightforward people with their practical kindness, she could find not just survival but a genuine home. The next few weeks passed in a blur of learning and adaptation. True to his word, Drew came by regularly to teach Teresa the skills she needed to maintain the homestead. Under his patient guidance, she learned to milk cows, mend fences, and tend the garden. The physical labor was unlike anything she had experienced in Boston, leaving her muscles aching and her hands blistered at first, but gradually building strength she hadn't known she possessed. Mrs. Holloway proved an exacting but effective teacher in the domestic arts. 3 mornings a week, Teresa arrived at the boarding house before dawn to learn bread making, preserving, and basic cookery. The older woman showed no patience for mistakes but offered grudging approval when Teresa mastered a new skill. "You're not as hopeless as I feared," Mrs. Holloway admitted one morning as Teresa successfully turned out her first batch of biscuits. "Your aunt would be pleased to see you taking to homestead life." "Did you know her well?" Teresa asked, seizing the rare opportunity to learn more about her aunt. Mrs. Holloway's typically stern expression softened slightly. "Martha and I came west in the same wagon train back in '52. 2 unmarried women determined to make our own way. Most thought we were mad or worse." She shook her head at the memory. "We supported each other through those early years." She was a woman of uncommon strength and kindness. "I wish I had known her," Teresa said quietly, feeling the loss of a connection she had never had the chance to make. "She spoke of you," Mrs. Holloway revealed unexpectedly. "Not often, but sometimes. She kept a small portrait miniature, you as a child, I believe, said her brother had sent it years ago." This revelation struck Teresa deeply. Her father had never mentioned maintaining any contact with his estranged sister. What else had he kept from her about their family? As autumn progressed, bringing cooler nights and spectacular golden days, Teresa found herself settling into the rhythms of frontier life. The initial strangeness gave way to routine, and with each small triumph, her first successful loaf of bread, the harvest of vegetables she had tended herself, the completion of repairs she had made with her own hands, came a growing sense of capability. Drew remained a constant presence, writing over every few days to check on her progress and offer assistance with the more challenging aspects of homestead management. Their initial formality gradually gave way to comfortable friendship as they worked side by side, sharing stories of their respective upbringings and experiences. Teresa learned that Drew had been the youngest of 5 sons, determined to forge his own path rather than compete with his brothers for their father's approval. His journey west had been driven by a desire to build something that was entirely his own, not inherited or granted by family connection. "I wanted to succeed or fail on my own merits," he explained one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of copper and gold. "My father thought I was running away from responsibility. Maybe I was, in part, but I also wanted to discover who I could be beyond being the youngest O'Malley boy." "I understand that desire," Teresa replied, thinking of her own upbringing. "In Boston, my path was predetermined. Marriage to a suitable man, a house near my parents, children raised exactly as I had been. There was safety in that predictability, but also a kind of suffocation." Drew glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "And now? Do you miss the certainty of that life?" Teresa considered the question seriously. "I miss knowing what tomorrow will bring, but I don't miss the constraints." She looked out over the land that was now hers, the garden with its last autumn vegetables, the creek winding through cottonwoods beginning to lose their leaves, the distant hills touched by early snow. "Here I'm learning who I am beyond the expectations of others. It's terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure." As they sat in companionable silence, Teresa realized with sudden clarity that she had begun to think of this place not as her aunt's homestead, but as her home. The transition had happened gradually, without her conscious awareness, but it was undeniable. This small cabin, with its single room and simple furnishings, had become more truly home than the elegant Boston townhouse had ever been. The realization both comforted and unsettled her. She had come west believing that true security lay in wealth and social position. But here, among people who measured worth by character rather than currency, she was discovering a different kind of security, one built on community, self-reliance, and genuine connection. Drew had become central to that sense of belonging. His steady presence and unfailing support had created a foundation upon which she could build her new life. Their friendship had deepened with each shared task and conversation, evolving into something Teresa valued more than she cared to admit, even to herself. She was not naive enough to miss the signs that Drew's interest might extend beyond neighborly kindness. The way his gaze lingered when he thought she wasn't looking, his readiness to ride miles in any weather to help with the smallest problem, the gentle care he took to teach without diminishing her independence, all suggested feelings deeper than mere friendship. Yet he maintained a careful distance, never presuming or pressing for more than she offered. His restraint spoke of respect and patience, qualities Teresa had rarely encountered in the men of her acquaintance in Boston, where courtship often resembled a business transaction more than a meeting of hearts. As October gave way to November, and the first serious snowfall blanketed the countryside, Teresa faced new challenges. The isolation of winter was unlike anything she had experienced, days when snow made travel impossible, nights when the wind howled around the cabin's corners like a living thing seeking entrance. The physical demands increased as well, with wood to be chopped, animals to be tended regardless of weather, and constant vigilance required to maintain adequate heat. Drew had ensured her woodpile was substantial before the first storm, but as he had warned, nothing could fully prepare her for the reality of a Montana winter. The cold penetrated everywhere, seeping through walls and windows despite her best efforts to seal them. Morning chores became tests of endurance as she forced herself from the warmth of her bed into the pre-dawn darkness to milk cows with fingers so numb she could barely feel the teats. Yet there was beauty in the season as well, the pristine expanse of unbroken snow stretching to the horizon, the crystalline clarity of star-filled nights when the temperature plunged below zero, the rare, precious moments of warmth by the fire with a book from her aunt's collection. Teresa began to understand why her aunt had chosen this life despite its hardships. There was an elemental honesty to it, a direct connection between effort and survival that stripped away pretense and revealed the essence of living. Drew continued to visit whenever weather permitted, often bringing supplies from town along with news and mail. His arrivals became the highlights of Teresa's increasingly isolated days, bringing not just practical assistance but companionship that she found herself craving more with each passing week. One particularly bitter December afternoon, Drew arrived during a lull in a 3-day blizzard, his horse struggling through drifts that reached its chest in places. Teresa had been alone for nearly a week, the storm making travel impossible even to her nearest neighbors. "You shouldn't have risked the journey," she scolded as she helped him bring his half-frozen horse into the barn. "The weather could have turned worse at any moment." Drew stamped snow from his boots, his face red from the biting cold. "I was concerned. No one's seen smoke from your chimney since yesterday morning." "I've been conserving wood," Teresa explained, touched by his worry. "The storm has lasted longer than I expected." Drew frowned as he removed his heavy coat. "You can't risk letting the fire die completely. The temperature is dropping below zero at night." Once inside the cabin, Drew immediately set to building up the fire while Teresa prepared coffee. She noticed his concern as he surveyed her diminished woodpile. "This won't last another 2 days," he said, his expression grave. "Why didn't you send word that you were running low?" "How exactly was I supposed to do that?" Teresa asked, a hint of frustration coloring her tone. "Walk 3 miles through snow up to my waist." Drew's worried expression didn't ease. "I should have checked sooner. I got caught up helping the Johnsons with a sick calf and lost track of the days." He paced the small confines of the cabin, clearly making calculations. "I'll stay tonight, help you cut more wood tomorrow if the storm breaks. If not," he hesitated, "you might need to consider moving to town until spring." Teresa bristled at the suggestion. "This is my home. I'm not abandoning it at the first real challenge." "It's not about abandonment," Drew countered. "It's about survival. Your aunt used to winter in town when conditions were severe. There's no shame in recognizing when solitude becomes dangerous." Teresa knew he was right, but the thought of retreating felt like failure. She had worked so hard to establish herself here, to prove, to herself as much as to others, that she could adapt to this frontier life. Leaving, even temporarily, seemed like an admission that she wasn't equal to the challenge. They reached an uneasy compromise. Drew would stay the night and help replenish her wood supply the next day. If the weather worsened again, they would reconsider the situation. As evening descended, bringing with it plummeting temperatures, They shared a simple meal of venison stew Teresa had prepared from meat Drew had brought on a previous visit. The single room of the cabin, warmed by the now roaring fire, created an intimacy neither of them acknowledged directly but both clearly felt. "Tell me more about Boston," Drew said as they sat before the fire afterward, the wind rattling the windows with increasing ferocity. "You rarely speak of your life there." Teresa stared into the flames, considering what to share. There's not much to tell that would make sense to someone who hasn't experienced it. It was a life of carefully observed social rules. Who could call on whom, what could be said in public versus private, how to dress for each specific occasion. "Sounds exhausting," Drew observed with a slight smile. It was, Teresa agreed, but there was comfort in the predictability. Everyone knew their place and role. She paused, remembering. "My parents were not among the highest social circles, but respectable enough. My father was in shipping, imported goods from Europe and Asia. My mother managed our household and our social connections." "And what was expected of you?" Drew asked, his gaze intent. "To make a suitable marriage," Teresa replied without hesitation. "That was the primary goal of my education and upbringing, to become the kind of wife a successful man would want. I learned French, music, art, literature, household management, everything that would make me an asset to a husband's social aspirations." "Not your own aspirations." The question startled Teresa with its directness. "Women of my class weren't encouraged to have personal aspirations beyond marriage and motherhood. Oh, we could engage in charity work or cultural pursuits, but always within acceptable boundaries." Drew was silent for a long moment, watching her face in the firelight. "Do you regret leaving that world behind?" "I didn't exactly leave by choice," Teresa reminded him. "After my parents died, there was nothing left for me there." She hesitated, then admitted what she had only recently acknowledged to herself. "But no, I don't regret it. Despite the hardships here, I feel more alive than I ever did in Boston." "Because of the freedom," Drew suggested. "Partly," Teresa agreed. "But also because here, I'm valued for what I can do rather than how I appear or who my family is. When Mrs. Holloway praises my bread, it's because I've truly learned to make good bread, not because social convention requires her to compliment me. When neighbors appreciate my garden, it's because I've actually grown something worthwhile. There's an honesty to life here that I find refreshing." Drew nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's what drew me to the West as well. The stripping away of pretense. A man is judged by his actions, not his name or background." The wind howled particularly fiercely, causing the cabin to creak and moan. Drew rose to add another log to the fire. "It's going to be a bitter night," he observed. "You should take the bed. I'll make a pallet here by the fire." Teresa had been considering the sleeping arrangements with increasing anxiety as the evening progressed. Propriety dictated that they shouldn't stay under the same roof unchaperoned, but necessity overrode social convention. Still, the intimacy of sharing the small cabin space left her feeling uncharacteristically flustered. "I couldn't take your bed," Drew continued when she didn't immediately respond. "I've slept in far worse conditions on cattle drives." "Of course," Teresa managed, grateful for his matter-of-fact approach to the situation. Later, as she lay beneath her aunt's colorful quilt, listening to the storm rage outside and the occasional crackle of the fire, Teresa found sleep elusive. The awareness of Drew's presence just feet away, his breathing steady in the darkness, created a tension she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear or discomfort, but something more complex, a heightened consciousness of him as a man, not just a helpful neighbor. In Boston, unmarried men and women were never permitted such proximity without supervision. Courtship proceeded along carefully prescribed lines, with chaperoned visits and formal declarations of intent. Here on the frontier, such niceties often gave way to practical considerations, yet underlying social expectations remained. Teresa knew that in the eyes of her neighbors, Drew's frequent visits and assistance had likely already marked him as a potential suitor. Widow Parker's comments at the gathering had made that clear enough, yet neither she nor Drew had acknowledged any romantic undercurrent to their growing friendship. As she finally drifted toward sleep, Teresa wondered if her reluctance to recognize Drew's interest or her own responding feelings stemmed from her Boston training or from the walls she had built around her heart after losing her parents. Trust and attachment now seemed dangerous, paths to inevitable pain and loss. It was safer to focus on immediate survival, on learning the skills she needed to maintain independence, than to risk her heart on emotional connections that could be severed as abruptly as her ties to her parents had been. Morning brought a temporary respite from the storm. Drew was already awake when Teresa rose, stoking the fire and preparing coffee with the easy familiarity of someone comfortable in her space. The domesticity of the scene struck her with unexpected force, this glimpse of what shared life might be like, with its simple rhythms and quiet companionship. Storms eased for now, Drew reported as he handed her a steaming cup. We should use the opportunity to cut as much wood as possible. I don't like the look of those clouds to the north. They worked together through the morning, Drew felling trees at the edge of the property while Teresa helped stack and split the smaller pieces. The physical labor was demanding but satisfying, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they established a smooth working rhythm. By midday, they had assembled an impressive woodpile that would see Teresa through several more weeks of winter. As they paused to rest and warm themselves with more coffee, Drew broached the subject Teresa had been avoiding. "Teresa, I need to speak plainly," he began, his expression serious. "This winter is proving harsher than usual. I'm concerned about you being out here alone, especially when storms make the trails impassable for days at a time." Teresa tensed, anticipating another suggestion that she relocate to town. "I'm managing well enough." "Please hear me out," Drew interrupted gently. "I know how important your independence is to you. I admire your determination to make this homestead work, but there are realities of frontier life that can't be overcome by will alone." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've been thinking about this for some time, and the situation with the woodpile has only confirmed my concerns. I would like to propose a partnership." Teresa blinked, not understanding. "Partnership?" "A marriage of convenience," Drew clarified, his voice steady despite the significance of the words. "It would solve practical problems for both of us. You would have consistent help with the heavier work of maintaining your homestead, and I could focus on expanding my herd without worrying about you being alone out here." Teresa felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Of all the ways she had imagined this conversation might unfold, this coolly logical proposal was not among them. "You're suggesting marriage as a business arrangement?" she asked, unable to keep the incredulity from her voice. Drew's expression remained earnest. Many frontier marriages begin that way, two people with complementary needs and abilities joining forces to better survive. It's a practical solution to the challenges we both face. "And what of affection?" "Compatibility, the things that should underlie a marriage," Teresa demanded, a strange hurt building in her chest at the impersonal nature of his proposal. "We get along well enough," Drew replied, seeming genuinely puzzled by her reaction. "We've already established that we can work together effectively. The rest often follows in time." Teresa stood abruptly, needing distance to process the unexpected offer and her even more unexpected emotional response to it. "I can't discuss this now. The weather is clearing, and you should return to your own property while travel is possible." Drew rose as well, concern evident in his expression. "I've upset you, that wasn't my intention." "You haven't upset me," Teresa insisted, though they both knew it for a lie. "I simply need time to consider such a significant proposition." Drew nodded slowly. Of course, it's not a decision to be made lightly. He began gathering his things, preparing for departure. "For what it's worth, I didn't make the suggestion lightly either." As she watched him saddle his horse a short time later, Teresa struggled to understand her own tumultuous feelings. Drew's proposal made perfect logical sense. Many frontier marriages were indeed based on practical considerations rather than romantic attachment. Yet something in her rebelled against the notion of entering marriage as a business arrangement, despite having been raised to view matrimony precisely that way in Boston society. "I'll check on you in a few days," Drew said as he mounted his horse. "Think about what I've said, Teresa. Whatever you decide, I'll respect your choice." As he rode away, Teresa returned to the cabin, her thoughts in disarray. Why had his practical proposal wounded her so deeply? The answer came with reluctant clarity as she stoked the fire against the returning chill. Somewhere in their weeks of friendship and shared work, she had developed feelings for Drew that went beyond practical appreciation for his help. The realization was unwelcome. She had come west determined to build a self-sufficient life, not to recreate the very dependency she had sought to escape. Yet as the afternoon progressed and the storm resumed with renewed ferocity, Teresa found herself examining her reaction with growing honesty. Perhaps what had hurt was not the practical nature of Drew's proposal, but the absence of any mention of deeper feelings. Had she hoped, secretly, that he might declare affection or even love? The thought was disturbing in its vulnerability. Since her parents' death, Teresa had carefully guarded her heart against further loss, believing that emotional independence was the only true security. Drew's steady presence in her life had begun to undermine that belief, creating an attachment she had been reluctant to acknowledge even to herself. As darkness fell and the wind howled around the cabin, Teresa faced a difficult truth. In rejecting the idea of marriage as a business arrangement, she was acknowledging that she wanted more from Drew than practical partnership. The realization left her feeling exposed and uncertain. If she admitted to deeper feelings, she risked the very pain she had been so determined to avoid. Yet as she added wood to the fire, wood that Drew had cut to ensure her safety and comfort, Teresa couldn't deny the evidence of his care. Perhaps his proposal had been framed in practical terms because he too feared rejection, or because the straightforward culture of the frontier discouraged flowery declarations. The next few days brought continued storms and solitude, giving Teresa ample time for reflection. She thought about her life in Boston, where marriage had been presented as an economic and social transaction, and her initial reaction to Drew's similarly practical proposal. The contradiction was striking. In Boston, she had accepted without question that marriage was primarily a practical alliance. Here on the frontier, where such pragmatism was even more justified, she found herself longing for romance. Perhaps the difference lay not in the nature of the arrangement, but in her own transformed expectations. In Boston, she had never expected love to factor into her marital future. But the West, for all its hardships, had awakened possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine before, including the possibility of a partnership based on genuine affection and respect rather than social convention. When Drew finally returned nearly a week later, Teresa had reached no clear decision. The sight of him approaching through the snow, his familiar figure bundled against the cold, sent her heart racing in a way that confirmed the deeper feelings she had been reluctant to acknowledge. "I was beginning to worry," she said as she helped him unsaddle his horse in the barn. "The storms have been relentless." "I would have come sooner, but Johnson's youngest fell ill with fever," Drew explained, his expression revealing concern beyond what neighborly interest would warrant. "I didn't want to risk bringing sickness to you." The consideration behind his absence touched Teresa deeply. This was the man she had come to know, thoughtful, responsible, putting others' welfare before his own convenience. Inside the cabin, as they warmed themselves by the fire, Teresa found herself studying Drew with new awareness. The steadiness that had first drawn her attention remained his defining quality, but she now recognized the depth of character beneath his quiet demeanor, the integrity that guided his actions, the genuine kindness that extended beyond mere politeness, the intelligence that allowed him to thrive in this demanding environment. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Teresa said finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Drew met her gaze directly, neither pressing nor withdrawing, and "I have questions," she began carefully. "In Boston, I was raised to view marriage as a social contract, with clear expectations for both parties. I'd like to understand what such a partnership would mean here between us." Drew considered her words thoughtfully. "Fair enough. Ask what you need to know." "Would we live here or at your ranch?" Teresa began with the most practical consideration. "Both properties would need attention," Drew replied. "But your homestead is better situated for a family home, closer to town and with the creek providing year-round water. I've been considering building a proper house at my place, but it would make more sense to improve this cabin first, perhaps add rooms as needed." His mention of a family home sent a flutter through Teresa's chest. "And children, would you want them?" A slight smile curved Drew's lips. "Yes, in time, though that would be for us to decide together when you felt ready." Teresa nodded, appreciating his consideration. "What about my independence? I've worked hard to learn the skills needed to maintain this place. I wouldn't want to become merely a housekeeper." Drew looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Teresa, I've never met a woman less suited to being merely anything. Marriage wouldn't change who you are or what you're capable of. It would simply mean sharing the burdens and joys of this life, rather than facing them alone." His understanding of her concerns moved her deeply. "One final question then," Teresa said, gathering her courage. "You spoke of marriage as a practical arrangement. Is that all it would be to you?" For the first time, Drew's composure faltered. He looked away briefly, then back at her with unexpected vulnerability in his eyes. "No," he said quietly, "that's not all it would be, but I didn't want to presume." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "When I came west, I left behind certain expectations about my future. I thought I was choosing independence over connection, building a life that was entirely my own. Then I met you standing alone at that station, looking both lost and determined, and something shifted." He smiled slightly at the memory. "I told myself I was just being neighborly, offering help to a newcomer. But it was more than that from the beginning." Teresa felt her heart quickening at his words. "Why didn't you say this when you proposed?" Drew's expression held a hint of self-deprecation. "Because out here, practical considerations matter. I wanted you to know I could be a good partner in the work of survival before I admitted to deeper feelings. And perhaps," he hesitated again, "perhaps I was protecting myself as well. Rejection of a practical proposal stings less than rejection of the heart." The simple honesty of his admission broke through Teresa's final reservations. She had been guarding her heart against precisely the kind of vulnerability Drew was now showing her. "I've been afraid," she confessed. "After losing my parents, I convinced myself that attachment only leads to pain. Coming west was partly about building a life that wouldn't depend on emotional connections that could be severed without warning." She met his gaze directly. "But I've learned that true independence doesn't mean isolation. And despite my best efforts to remain detached, I find myself caring for you in ways that go far beyond neighborly appreciation." Drew's face transformed with hope. "Are you saying yes to my proposal?" "I'm saying I need more than a practical arrangement," Teresa clarified. "If we marry, it should be because we choose each other, not just because winter is harsh and labor is easier shared." Drew moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Teresa Wilson, I'm asking for your hand not only because we work well together, though we do, but because in these past months, you've become essential to my happiness. Your courage, your determination, your willingness to face every challenge this frontier presents, they've captured my heart completely. I want to build a life with you not just because it makes practical sense, but because I cannot imagine my future without you in it." The words Teresa had not known she needed to hear washed over her like a warm current, melting the last of her resistance. "In that case, Andrew O'Malley, I accept your proposal, both the practical partnership and the matters of the heart." Drew's smile was radiant as he leaned forward to seal their agreement with a gentle kiss, their first, but carrying the promise of countless more to come. The following Sunday, Drew accompanied Teresa to church in Thunder Creek, where Reverend Howard announced their engagement to the congregation. The news was met with knowing smiles and congratulations that suggested many had anticipated this development long before the couple themselves had acknowledged their feelings. "About time," Widow Parker declared, patting Teresa's hand. "I told you winter was coming. Good to see you had the sense to secure a husband before the worst of it hit." Teresa exchanged an amused glance with Drew, no longer bothered by the older woman's blunt manner. "Your advice was most helpful, Mrs. Parker." With the community's blessing and support, preparations for the wedding began immediately. Given the unpredictability of winter travel, they decided on a date just 2 weeks hence, allowing time for necessary arrangements without risking further delays due to weather. The women of Thunder Creek rallied around Teresa with practical assistance and advice. Mrs. Holloway unexpectedly offered her parlor for the wedding breakfast, explaining gruffly that it was the only space in town large enough to accommodate the guests. Several ladies collaborated on adapting one of Martha's dresses into a suitable wedding gown for Teresa, while others prepared traditional wedding gifts of quilts, preserves, and household items. Drew, meanwhile, set about making improvements to the cabin that would transform it from a single woman's dwelling to a home for a married couple. With help from neighboring ranchers, he added a separate bedroom for privacy and enlarged the main room to better accommodate family life. The work progressed rapidly, frontier men being well-versed in the practical skills of building and eager to assist a friend entering matrimony. As the wedding day approached, Teresa found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. She had arrived in Montana Territory less than 4 months earlier, alone and adrift, her only plan being survival. Now she was preparing to marry a man who had first appeared to her as a stranger offering help with a heavy trunk. The evening before the wedding, as Teresa sat in her cabin completing final preparations, a knock at the door announced an unexpected visitor. Opening it, she found Mrs. Holloway standing on the porch, a wooden box in her hands. "May I come in?" the older woman asked, her typically stern expression softened by what appeared to be uncharacteristic emotion. "Of course," Teresa replied, surprised by the late visit. Mrs. Holloway placed the box on the table and stood looking around the cabin, noting the changes Drew and his friends had made. "Your aunt would approve," she said finally, "both of the improvements and of your choice of husband." "Thank you," Teresa said, touched by the rare personal comment. "That means a great deal to me." Mrs. Holloway opened the box, removing a small object wrapped in faded silk. "I came to bring you this. Martha asked me to keep it for her in case family ever came looking." She unwrapped the silk, revealing a delicate gold locket on a slender chain. "It was your grandmother's, then your aunt's. Martha would want you to have it for tomorrow." Teresa accepted the locket with trembling hands, opening it to find a tiny daguerreotype of a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to her father. "Is this my grandmother?" Mrs. Holloway nodded. "Elizabeth Wilson. She died when your father and Martha were young." Martha said it was her death that started the rift between them. Your father blamed their father for not getting the doctor in time, while Martha felt it was simply God's will. They both carried that hurt for decades. Yet he sent her my portrait, Teresa murmured, thinking of the miniature Mrs. Holloway had mentioned. "Families are complicated," the older woman said with the wisdom of experience. But Martha never stopped caring for her brother, despite the distance between them. When she learned of his death, she mourned deeply. Writing to you was her way of honoring what remained of her family. As Mrs. Holloway prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Marriage isn't easy, especially out here where every day brings challenges, but Martha always said the worst storm is better weathered with someone at your side." She met Teresa's eyes with unexpected warmth. "You've chosen well, Teresa. Drew O'Malley is a good man." "I know," Teresa replied simply. "Thank you for bringing the locket and for everything you've taught me these past months." After Mrs. Holloway departed, Teresa sat by the fire, the locket in her palm, contemplating the connections that had brought her to this place and moment. Her aunt, whom she had never met, had created both the physical home she now inhabited and the spiritual bridge that had led her to Drew. Her parents, for all their focus on social propriety, had given her the education and resilience that allowed her to adapt to this new world. Even Mrs. Holloway's stern lessons had prepared her for the responsibilities she was about to undertake as a frontier wife. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the December sun creating a glittering wonderland of the snow-covered landscape. Drew had stayed in town the previous night, honoring tradition despite the practical challenges it presented in winter conditions. Teresa dressed with the help of the minister's wife, who had arrived early bringing flowers forced in her kitchen window, a luxury almost unimaginable in the Montana winter. The wedding dress, transformed from one of Martha's finer gowns, was a simple creation of ivory wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Around her neck, Teresa wore the locket Mrs. Holloway had delivered, feeling a connection to the family history it represented. The church was filled to capacity despite the bitter cold, the community turning out in full force to witness the union of two of their own. As Teresa walked down the short aisle on the arm of Judge Barnes, who had offered to give her away in the absence of family, she saw Drew waiting at the altar. His expression as he watched her approach contained all the affirmation she needed that their marriage would be far more than a practical arrangement. Reverend Howard conducted a simple but meaningful ceremony, speaking of the particular challenges and rewards of marriage on the frontier. In the East, he noted, a couple may rely on extended family, established communities, and comfortable surroundings. Here you must rely primarily on each other, facing nature's trials and triumphs together. This creates a bond unlike any other, a partnership forged in the fire of necessity but tempered by choice and love. As Teresa and Drew exchanged vows, promising to cherish and support each other through all the seasons of life, Teresa felt the last of her reservations dissolving. The path ahead would not be easy. Frontier life guaranteed challenges that would test their strength and commitment, but they would face those challenges together, with the support of the community gathered around them. The wedding breakfast at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house was a celebration that brought warmth to the coldest day of the year thus far. Tables groaned under the weight of the community's contributions. Roasted venison, potato pies, preserved fruits, freshly baked breads, and cakes made with precious ingredients saved for special occasions. Music, laughter, and congratulations filled the rooms as neighbors came together to celebrate not just a marriage, but the continuation of their shared frontier life. Late in the afternoon, as the brief winter daylight began to fade, Drew and Teresa prepared to depart for their homestead. Friends had decorated the wagon with evergreen boughs and ribbons, transforming the practical vehicle into a festive conveyance. Bundled in furs against the cold, the newlyweds said their goodbyes amid good-natured teasing and sincere good wishes. As they drove away from town, following a trail now familiar to both of them, Teresa leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she first arrived at Thunder Creek Station. "Are you happy, Mrs. O'Malley?" Drew asked softly, his arm secure around her. The name, her new name, still sounded strange to her ears but right in her heart. "Yes," she replied simply. "Happier than I ever expected to be." They rode in comfortable silence for a time, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The cold was intense but somehow less threatening now that they faced it together. "I have something for you," Drew said as they approached the homestead. "A wedding gift. I was going to wait until we reached home, but—" He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. Teresa unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she found blank pages with a simple inscription on the first, "For Teresa, to record our life together. With love, Drew." "I noticed you writing sometimes in the evenings," Drew explained, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you kept a journal of your experiences since arriving. I thought you might like a new one for this new chapter." Teresa traced the inscription with her fingertip, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's perfect," she said, looking up at him with tears threatening despite the cold. "Thank you." As they crested the final rise before their homestead, Teresa gasped in surprise. The cabin windows glowed with warm light, smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and lanterns had been hung from the porch posts, creating a welcoming beacon in the gathering darkness. "How?" she began, turning to Drew in confusion. He smiled, pleased by her reaction. "Johnson and Miller rode ahead while we were at the breakfast. They've laid fires, lit lamps, and made sure everything was ready for our return. Their wives sent food enough for several days, so you wouldn't need to cook right away." The consideration behind the gesture moved Teresa deeply. This was the frontier community at its best, practical in its assistance, but deeply personal in its understanding of what would matter to a new bride. As they approached the cabin, their home now truly shared, Teresa felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. The journey that had begun in loss and uncertainty had led her to this place of belonging. The young woman who had stood alone at Thunder Creek Station just months ago, believing herself abandoned by fate, had found not just survival but love, community, and purpose in this harsh but beautiful territory. Drew helped her from the wagon with tender care, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Teresa O'Malley," he said softly as he set her on her feet inside the cabin, its familiar space now transformed by their shared presence. As he bent to kiss her, no longer constrained by the propriety that had governed their courtship, Teresa knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. Not in the elegant drawing rooms of Boston, but here on the Montana frontier, with this man who had offered her not just his home but his heart. The years that followed their wedding brought challenges and joys in equal measure, as frontier life demanded resilience and adaptability from all who chose its path. Teresa and Drew worked side by side to build their shared dream, expanding both the homestead and Drew's ranch into a prosperous operation that combined cattle raising with crop farming. The cabin grew as their family did. By their 5th anniversary, they had added 2 more bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides of the house. Their first child, a son they named Edward after Teresa's father, arrived 18 months after their wedding, a strong, healthy boy with his father's sandy hair and his mother's determined spirit. A daughter, Martha Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, her arrival coinciding with a spring so abundant in wildflowers that Drew filled the house with bouquets to celebrate both his new daughter and the season's promise. Teresa recorded these moments in the journal Drew had given her as a wedding gift, creating a chronicle of their life together that would someday be a legacy for their children. The community that had welcomed Teresa continued to be central to their lives. Barn raisings, harvest festivals, school functions, and church socials marked the passing seasons and reinforced the connections that made frontier life not just endurable but rich with shared experience. Teresa's initial amazement at the interdependence of frontier neighbors evolved into deep appreciation for a social system that valued practical assistance and genuine care above formal manners or material wealth. Mrs. Holloway remained a steadfast friend, her stern exterior gradually softening as she took on the role of honorary grandmother to the O'Malley children. Even Widow Parker, who lived to the remarkable age of 92, became a beloved fixture in their lives, her blunt observations and frontier wisdom providing both amusement and guidance. Drew's prediction that Teresa would never be merely anything proved accurate. She maintained her independence even as she embraced partnership, managing the homestead's finances and expansion with the same determination she had brought to learning its daily operations. When drought threatened their second year, it was Teresa who researched and implemented irrigation techniques that saved their crops and became a model for neighboring farms. Their marriage, begun with a proposal that balanced practicality with deeper feeling, developed into a union that encompassed both passionate love and steady companionship. They weathered storms both literal and figurative, harsh winters, economic downturns, the loss of Drew's father, and the subsequent reconciliation with his Eastern family. Moments of disagreement and misunderstanding that tested their commitment but ultimately strengthened their bond. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard that was now bordered by mature trees they had planted together, Drew took Teresa's hand, his expression reflective. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming west, staying when you could have returned east, marrying a rough rancher instead of the society gentleman your parents might have chosen?" Teresa considered the question seriously, as was her nature. "I regret not knowing my aunt," she said finally. "I regret that my parents never reconciled with her, that they didn't live to see the life I've built here." She squeezed his hand, meeting his gaze with the directness that had always characterized their relationship. "But I have never, not for a single moment, regretted coming west, staying, or choosing you. This life, our life, is richer and more meaningful than anything I could have imagined in Boston." As twilight settled over the Montana landscape they both loved, Teresa reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived at Thunder Creek Station alone and afraid, believing herself abandoned by fate. Instead, she had found a home not just in a place but in a community and in the heart of a man who had seen her courage and capability, even when she doubted both. The West had indeed proved challenging, as everyone had warned her upon arrival. But it had also proved to be the place where she discovered her true self, not the carefully trained Boston lady, nor the initially overwhelmed homesteader, but a woman of strength, adaptability, and deep capacity for love. And Drew, the young cowboy who had first offered assistance with a heavy trunk, had become the partner with whom she shared every aspect of life: the daily work and occasional hardships, the quiet evenings and joyful celebrations, the raising of their children and the building of their legacy. Their love, beginning in the practical necessities of frontier survival but growing into something far more profound, had given Teresa not just security but the freedom to become her fullest self. As stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Drew wrapped his arm around Teresa's shoulders, drawing her close against the evening chill. No words were needed between them in that moment, just the shared understanding of two people who had chosen each other and the life they had built together, finding in that choice all the adventure, purpose, and love that the frontier promised to those brave enough to seek it.